Germany, the spring of 1945. The war in Europe is almost over. A column of captured German soldiers is marched down a road, hands behind their heads, sure they know what comes next. They are picturing a building, walls, a roof, a bunk, a door that locks, the ordinary idea of what a prison is. Instead, the road ends at an open field surrounded by barbed wire, with no shelter of any kind, and the ground turned to thick mud by days of rain. This is the floor story of how some German prisoners expected a prison cell and got a mud field instead, and how a hard-driving American general decided that was exactly where they belonged. The general was George Patton, and the field said more about the end of the war than any cell ever could. To understand the field, you first have to understand the man and the moment. By the spring of 1945, General George S. Patton was one of the most famous commanders in the American Army. He led the Third Army, and he was known for one thing. Above all, speed. While other generals moved carefully, Patton pushed his men forward fast, racing across France and into Germany, capturing ground at a pace that stunned both his own side and the enemy. He was loud, profane, and impatient. He believed the fastest way to end the war was to hit hard and never stop. Patton was also a man who carried his beliefs to extremes. He was famous for his temper, for his blunt opinions, and for a deep, burning hatred of the Nazi regime once he understood what it had truly done. He was not the kind of commander who hid behind a desk far from the fighting. He drove to the front. He saw the war up close, the dead on both sides, the ruined towns, the cost of every mile. By the spring of 1945, he had been at it for years, and he had very little patience left for anyone connected to the regime he was helping to destroy. By this point in the war, his army was capturing enormous numbers of German soldiers. The German military was collapsing. Whole units were surrendering at once, sometimes thousands of men at a time, walking toward the Americans with their hands up because the alternative was to keep dying for a cause that was already lost. And that created a very real problem. What do you do with that many prisoners? This is where the story leaves the neat picture most people carry in their heads. When we imagine prisoners of war, we picture a proper camp, buildings, guards in towers, rows of bunks. But in the final weeks of the war, the Allies were taking in captured Germans faster than any normal camp system could possibly hold them. There were not enough buildings. There were not enough cells. There was not enough of anything for the sheer flood of men surrendering. So the Allies did something that surprised many of the prisoners. Along the Rhine River, they fenced off huge open fields with barbed wire and simply put the prisoners inside. No barracks, no roofs, often no cots, and very little cover from the weather. Just open ground, a wire fence, and the sky. These open-air enclosures were real, and for many German soldiers, they were a brutal shock. They had expected the structure of a normal prison. They got a field. Think about what that meant day to day. Men slept on the ground when it rained, and that dote. Spring it rained often. The ground turned to mud, and there was nowhere dry to go, food and clean. Water had to be brought in for enormous numbers of men all at once, and the supply lines were already stretched thin by the fighting. There were so many prisoners that simply counting them, feeding them, and keeping them behind the wire was a massive job. For soldiers who had marched into other countries as conquerors, sitting in a muddy field in their own homeland, waiting in line for a ration, was a complete reversal of everything they had known. Now, in our story, picture one such group arriving. These are not ordinary frightened conscripts. These are hardened men, some of them deeply loyal to the regime even now, at the very end. As they are marched in, some of them are still arrogant. They expect to be treated as soldiers, housed, fed, and handled according to the polite rules of war. A few of them, the story goes, even demand it. They want proper quarters. They want the dignity they believe their rank and their uniform entitle them to. In their minds, losing the war does not mean losing their status. And then word reaches Patton. In our telling, the general comes to look at this group himself. He has spent the last months driving across a ruined continent. He has seen what this war has done. And very soon, he and his men will see something far worse, because it was Patton's Third Army that helped liberate some of the Nazi camps, where they found the dead and the dying and proof of crimes almost beyond belief. That part is real history. When Patton walked into one of those camps, a hardened soldier who had seen years of combat, he was so sickened by what he found that he reportedly became physically ill. He ordered the local townspeople to walk through and see with their own eyes what had been done in their name. He wanted it documented, photographed, remembered, so that no one could ever deny it. A man who has seen that does not have much sympathy left for captured members of the regime that built it. Patton is not in a forgiving mood, and he has no patience for prisoners who think they are owed comfort. So when the prisoners expect a cell, Patton gives them the field. In the story, his reasoning is blunt and simple. There is no time, no shelter to spare, and no reason on earth to give comfort to the men who served the regime that did what this regime did. They wanted to be treated like honored soldiers. Instead, they would sit in the mud, behind the wire, under the open sky, and learn exactly how much their old status was worth now. The roof they expected was gone. The walls were gone. There was only the field, the rain, and time to think about how it had all ended. Let's sit with what that actually meant, because the power of this story is in the contrast. A cell, strange as it sounds, is a kind of order. It says there are still rules, still a structure, still a system that has a place for you. The mud field said something different. It said the world these men had helped build was finished, and the comfortable certainties that came with their uniforms were finished too. They had marched across Europe expecting to be conquerors. Now they sat in a wet field in their own country, guarded by the army that had beaten them, with nothing over their heads but clouds. For proud men, that humiliation cut deeper than any locked door, a cell they could have endured with their dignity intact. The mud took even that. Picture one of them sitting there. A few weeks ago, he wore a clean uniform and gave orders. He belonged to an army that had once made half of Europe afraid. Now he sits on wet ground inside a wire fence, his boots caked, his coat soaked through, watching a young American guard who barely looks at him. There is no cell door to stand behind, no walls to give him the feeling that he is still a soldier being held by rules. There is just the open field, the cold, and the slow understanding that the world he believed in is gone. No one is coming to restore his rank or his conference. Pride. The mud does not care who he was. It is worth being honest about something here. These open-air camps were not a gentle place, and history has argued ever since about how harsh they really were and how many men suffered in them. Holding that many prisoners in fields, in bad weather, with stretched supplies, led to real hardship. This is not a clean story of justice with no cost. It is a story about what happens at the end of a long and terrible war, when the side that started it finally loses and there is simply no soft landing left for anyone. In our story, Patton looks at that field full of defeated men and feels no urge to soften it, To him, the field is the truth. It is what the war has earned them. The men who once believed they would rule a continent are now sitting in the dirt, and the general who put them there does not look away. And that is the heart of why a story like this lands. It is the fall. These were people who had spent years on the winning side, certain of their power, certain the rules would always bend their way. The mud field is the moment the rules stop bending. It is the exact point where all that certainty meets the cold, wet ground. There is a larger truth underneath the drama too. War does not end with everyone shaking hands and going home as equals. It ends with one side beaten and with the hard, uncomfortable business of what to do with the defeated. The image of proud soldiers expecting a cell and finding a field is really an image of that whole moment. The grand plans, the conquests, the belief in their own superiority. All of it ends in a muddy enclosure by a river, guarded by the men they once looked down on. That is the picture worth remembering. Not because it is satisfying to see anyone suffer, but because it shows how completely the story turned. The people who expected to write history ended up sitting in the mud of it. So here is what I want to ask you, and I would honestly like to hear your answer. If you had been the one making the decision at the end of that war, with too many prisoners and not enough of anything, and with the horrors of the camps fresh in your mind, what would you have done? Would you have found a way to give them proper shelter? Or would you have done what Patton does in this story and let the field be the answer? There is no easy reply, and I think the comments on this one will be worth reading. Tell me where you land. If this story held your attention, take a second to hit the like button. It genuinely helps more. People find these moments from the end of the war, and it tells the algorithm that stories like this are worth showing to others. And before you go, there is another story you should hear, because in those same final weeks, Patton's men walked into a salt mine deep underground and found something that left them speechless. A fortune in hidden Nazi gold, stacked in the dark, along with treasures stolen from across a continent. That is the story coming next. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Thanks for watching.